Racism often wears a uniform, but one night in a quiet suburban neighborhood, that false authority crossed a line it couldn't take back. Acting on a vague, anonymous tip, a team of white officers stormed the home of a black woman without a warrant, tore through her belongings, and arrested her on false charges. What they didn't know was that she was the director of Homeland Security, and by the time they realized their mistake, justice was already in motion. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The last slant of sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors like gold threads, catching on the framed medals that hung in perfect alignment above the stone fireplace. Celeste James moved through the quiet of her home with the grace of someone long accustomed to command, but no longer needing to raise her voice to enforce it. Everything around her had its place. Everything was as it should be. Her house, tucked neatly at the end of a curved cul-de-sac, blended seamlessly into its surroundings. Modern, tasteful, and intentionally unremarkable. White trim framed the gray stone siding, while a narrow porch held two carefully arranged flower pots, each one seasonally maintained with quiet discipline. To a passing glance, the home could have belonged to a retired professor, perhaps a widowed writer, someone polished but ordinary. There was no visible security, no boast of rank or wealth. That, too, was by design. Inside, it was another world. Celeste sat at the glass dining table, posture as straight as a ruler, tablet in hand. A secure feed streamed quietly before her. Encrypted chatter from suspect accounts, unusual purchase patterns flagged by federal monitors, and a curated list of departmental personnel glowing in amber against a black interface. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she tapped one of the names. It expanded to reveal the latest internal review forwarded by Agent Marcus Thorne. One of their flagged officers, a mid-tier patrolman with 3 excessive force complaints already on record, had just received another suspicious deposit from an untraceable crypto source. Again. She entered a brief note in her private log. Her fingers moved efficiently across the soft-lit keys. The keyboard made no sound. The open-concept living space remained still, interrupted only by the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the subtle beeping of background access logs cycling through silent updates. In the adjacent kitchen, a kettle cooled on the induction stove. Her dinner, long finished, had been a routine meal. Broiled salmon, a cucumber and dill salad, and a glass of still water. It was always the same on Thursdays. Routine wasn't just comfort. It was strategy. Predictability brought clarity. Control. Upstairs, the smallest guest room had been converted into what could only be described as a private field post. Black servers stood humming beneath a custom desk, cables arranged with precision, monitors positioned in perfect geometric symmetry. The shelf above held a small collection of labeled flash drives and encrypted burners, each one tagged with numerical codes that only she could interpret. But she rarely worked from that room anymore. Most of the incoming field data came directly to her wristwatch or tablet now, and she preferred the silence of the first floor. She checked the time. 9:42 p.m. Still early enough to finish reviewing the precinct's personnel rotation reports before logging off. Somewhere just beyond the fenced tree line of her yard, a dog barked once and fell silent. Down the street, the rhythmic ticking of sprinkler systems began to cycle, rising in sequence like clockwork. Porch lights glowed across manicured lawns. Her neighborhood, quiet, suburban, and seemingly untouched by chaos, had always felt like a sanctuary from the corruption she worked to expose daily. The irony of that had never been lost on her. She was halfway through a flagged text thread, its language subtly evasive, when her system pinged twice in quick succession and then went still. She froze. That pattern was rare. It meant something had tripped the passive surveillance perimeter she maintained around her home. Normally, it was nothing more than a passing cat or teenagers cutting across lawns. Still, Celeste James had never made a habit of ignoring the little things. Remaining seated, she reached for the tablet again and toggled the cam feed embedded near the front of the house. The night vision flickered for a moment, then leveled out into its familiar dull green glow. A vehicle, dark, SUV class, had pulled up along the curb just outside her driveway. The headlights were dimmed. The engine was still running. The license plates were partially obscured, either by dirt or design. The camera zoomed once. 4 adult males sat inside. No movement yet. No one had exited. Celeste narrowed her eyes. No visible weapons. No ski masks. No obvious signs of a threat. But something was wrong. Years spent operating in unstable countries, places where your life often depended on noticing the wrong twitch in a soldier's cheek or a shadow in the wrong window, had sharpened her instincts beyond anything most domestic agents could measure. There was no visible cause for alarm yet. No breach. No action taken. But instinct said otherwise. On the other side of the windshield, Officer Cole Renner adjusted his collar and leaned forward, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. His jaw worked slowly as he scanned the house, lips curled with a mixture of irritation and certainty. In his passenger seat, Officer Rick Donnelly shifted uncomfortably, double-checked his holster, and glanced toward the dash-mounted laptop that held nothing but a hastily typed copy of the anonymous tip they'd received. Neither man wore standard uniforms. Instead, they donned plain tactical gear, soft shell jackets, sidearms holstered low, body cams clipped at their chests. They hadn't called for backup, hadn't filed for a warrant. They hadn't even bothered to alert dispatch that they were approaching the house. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to prove something. Inside, Celeste stood slowly, her blouse settling neatly over her slacks. She moved through the living room with controlled precision, her bare feet silent on the dark oak floor. She stopped just behind the curtain, keeping to the shadow, and watched as the 4 figures stepped out of the SUV in near unison. No identification, no words, just pale faces under the streetlight and the heavy, deliberate sound of boots grinding against her gravel path. She stepped back, calmly, but with absolute clarity. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate strikes against the door. Not a knock, a warning. She glanced at the secure control panel mounted near the staircase. No alerts, no city system pings, no badge verification. Whoever they were not logged. They were not official. Another pound. Louder this time. The doorframe quivered. Celeste took a breath. Steady, deep, unshaken. "Who is it?" she called, her voice clear, calm, and unmistakably in control. Silence. Another heavy blow. She took 1 step toward the entryway. The door exploded inward. Wood shattered. Hinges tore loose. The frame burst open as 2 officers surged inside, flashlights sweeping violently across the space. Boots thundered on tile. Orders clashed in overlapping chaos. "Hands where I can see them! Get on the ground, now! Show me your hands!" It didn't matter that no threat had been visible, that no weapons were drawn from her end, that the house was still and silent, marked only by meticulous order and clean surfaces. The very act of forced entry had become justification enough. In the hallway, Celeste stepped into view. Her posture was tall, shoulders back, eyes forward. She wore no shoes, held no weapon, just a sleek black tablet in her left hand, blinking softly with federal encryption tags. Before she could speak, Officer Renner moved. He charged. She was tackled to the tile with no warning. The tablet slid across the floor. Her arms were yanked behind her. A knee drove into her spine. "What the hell are you doing?" she gasped, voice tight with fury and pain. "You need to step back and identify yourselves. Right now." Renner said nothing as he snapped the cuffs around her wrists, pressing harder as if to erase her voice through force alone. "You got weapons in here? Where are they?" "Upstairs," he barked. "No," she answered, the words clipped by the pressure of his weight. "You just broke into the home of a federal officer. You're going to regret every second of what you're doing." Renner sneered down at her. "Save it," he said, lips close to her ear. "You're not scaring anyone with your fake titles." But something flickered in Donnelly's eyes, hesitation, maybe even recognition, as he scanned the space around them. No evidence of a crime, no sounds of danger, just a calm, elegant home, and a woman who hadn't screamed once. And somewhere in that silence, a truth was already taking shape. He pulled her up roughly and shoved her against the wall. She didn't resist, didn't shout. Her breath came steady through flared nostrils. Her eyes didn't blink. Donnelly swept past the living room, into the office space. He hesitated, looking at the setup. He recognized the gear, high-end, secure, government level. He felt a prickle run down his spine. "Renner," he called over his shoulder, "we need to slow this down." "You're too soft," Renner shot back, already moving into the next room. "We're doing our job." But Donnelly's gut was twisting now. Something about the house didn't add up. This wasn't some low-level arms drop spot. Everything was too precise, too clean. And the woman, she wasn't afraid. She was furious and confident. Confident enough to believe they'd made a mistake they couldn't undo. And somewhere behind all of Donnelly's training, a warning bell had started to ring. Too quiet to stop the raid, but just loud enough to remind him. They hadn't checked who they were really dealing with. Not yet. The sound of a drawer slamming open echoed down the hall like a gunshot. Donnelly winced, but didn't stop Renner. He trailed behind him now, flashlight beam scanning every untouched surface like it held the answer to why they were really here. In the hallway, books lay scattered across the floor. History, political science, case law. Not the kind of reading you'd find in a dealer's den. Renner moved like a man convinced. He kicked open the linen closet, swiped a gloved hand through folded towels, and yanked down a box of photo albums that landed with a heavy thud on the floor. Pages fluttered out. Family portraits, military ceremonies, graduation pictures. One showed the same woman they had cuffed, shaking hands with a man in a Navy uniform beneath a Pentagon seal. Renner didn't even look. "Where's the cash?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They always hide them behind clean lives like this." Donnelly stood still in the doorway, breathing through his nose, jaw tight. He knew the signs of a real bust: panic, disruption, the smell of desperation. This house didn't have that. What it had was order, discipline, control. But that wasn't stopping Renner. In the kitchen, drawers clattered as utensils and papers spilled out across the tile. A fruit bowl rolled off the counter and shattered. Renner swept through it all like a man trying to make the house guilty. Every corner became a target, every object an accusation. Down the hall, Celeste sat on the floor, cuffed and silent now, posture upright despite the bruises forming beneath her sleeves. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes followed Renner's every move with a sharp, lethal calm. "You've made a mistake," she said again, voice even but cold. "You're going to regret this. Every second." Renner looked over his shoulder and sneered. "I've heard better lies from crackheads. I gave you a lawful command to identify yourselves before entry. You gave us attitude," he snapped, turning back to the hallway closet and rifling through its contents. "I gave you restraint," she answered. Donnelly flinched. It was the way she said it, not loudly, not as a threat. As a fact. Renner didn't catch it. He was too busy kicking in the door to a basement she didn't even use, yelling down the stairs as if an army might be waiting below. Nothing but the hum of a freezer and stacked emergency supplies greeted him. Still, he descended. Donnelly finally moved toward her, crouching halfway down. "Ma'am," he started, keeping his voice low. "Is there anyone else in the house? Any weapons we need to know about?" Her eyes locked on him. "You need to call your supervisor. Now. I'm trying to work with you." "No," she said, sharp now. "You don't get to pretend we're on the same side. You let him break into my home. You let him pin me to the floor like an animal. You stood there while he destroyed everything I built. So don't call this working with me." He opened his mouth, then shut it. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "I live here alone," she continued. "I own everything in this house. I have no criminal record. I have held federal clearance longer than you've worn that badge. You're in a place you don't understand, chasing ghosts based on a lie. You're saying the tip was fake? I'm saying the tip was planted," she said. "I'm saying you're being used." The floor above them creaked. More boots, more voices. They were flipping mattresses now, searching behind walls, pulling out vent covers. And the house, a home just hours ago, was no longer a place of safety. The warmth was gone. The air now held the scent of sweat, rubber gloves, and broken trust. Donnelly stood and stepped into the hallway. He pulled out his radio, uncertain of what he even meant to say, when Renner's voice cut through the noise. "Bingo!" Donnelly hurried toward the sound. In the office, Renner stood beside a wall safe, its door now open. He held up a sleek black case, unlatching it to reveal a pistol nestled in foam lining. "Unregistered Glock," Renner said with satisfaction, though he hadn't checked the serial number. He was already assuming guilt. "She tried to hide it, but we got it." Donnelly frowned. He stepped closer, noting the manufacturer's stamp and intact serial. "That's not unregistered. That's clean. She said she has federal clearance. She probably has a carry permit." "She's lying," Renner barked. "You think some deep state spook's gonna live out here in the suburbs? She's fronting. These people always pretend until they get caught." "These people," Donnelly repeated, more to himself than anyone else. The room was spinning now, not with motion, but with realization. The woman on the floor, the books, the photographs, the encrypted systems, all of it was true. She wasn't lying. She wasn't resisting. She was watching them build a case on nothing. Back in the living room, Celeste sat perfectly still. Her eyes scanned the walls. Her cameras were gone. Disconnected or smashed. She knew the pattern now. She had seen it before, in other cities, with other officers. The same posture. The same arrogance. The same erasure of dignity disguised as protocol. But this time, they had chosen the wrong house, the wrong woman. Renner swaggered back into the room, gun case in hand. "You're under arrest for unlawful possession of a firearm," he said. Celeste lifted her chin. "That weapon is registered with the federal government and tied to my active duty credentials. You're about to fabricate a charge that will cost you your badge." "Oh, yeah?" he smirked. "We'll see how your story holds up in the report." She stared at him. Then, calmly, coolly, "You will lose everything." Renner's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened, like he was savoring the moment before the press of a trigger. He turned slightly toward Donnelly and gave the smallest nod, a signal that wasn't formal, but unmistakable. Donnelly knew what it meant, even before Renner's fingers brushed against the edge of his body cam. Click. The green light faded. Donnelly hesitated. Then, slowly, like it was a reflex more than a choice, he did the same. Click. Another green light disappeared. Celeste saw it. Both moves. And for a moment, there was silence. Heavy, damning silence. "You really just did that," she said, voice low. You really turned them off. Renner shrugged, resting the gun case on the arm of the couch like it was a trophy. For officer safety, he said casually. Standard discretion. Nothing about this has been standard, she replied. You forced entry without cause. You searched without consent. You're holding me without Miranda. And now you're going to doctor footage? Renner waved a hand. You keep talking like this is court already. We're still on scene. Anything can happen. Celeste's lips pressed into a line, her jaw set like stone. She shifted slightly in the cuffs, not to escape, but to steady herself. I want a lawyer, she said. You'll get one, Renner said, already moving to his belt. At the station. I'm invoking my rights now, she repeated. He ignored her. You're escalating without justification, Donnelly said under his breath, suddenly uncertain. Renner threw him a look. You in or out, Rick? You want me to write this up solo? Donnelly hesitated again, just long enough for guilt to get a foothold, but not long enough for courage. I'll back the report, he muttered. Celeste turned to face Donnelly. There was no contempt in her stare, only certainty. You know what you're doing, she said softly. You know this is wrong. Donnelly didn't respond. He walked toward the front door, pretending to inspect the busted frame. Renner pulled Celeste roughly to her feet. You're resisting, he said, as he yanked her arm. I am not, she snapped, steady on her legs. He jerked her harder. You just tensed up. That's resisting. She laughed once, bitter and cold. You're really going to put that in your report, aren't you? Suspect tensed while standing. We've charged people for less. He started walking her toward the door, but she didn't move fast enough for him. Move, he barked, shoving her forward. She stumbled once, caught herself, and turned her head just slightly. You're doing this for what? A headline? A promotion? You think you'll make Lieutenant framing a woman in her own home? Renner didn't answer. His silence wasn't doubt. It was calculation. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit her skin like a slap. Neighbors had gathered now, silent, confused, phones up, filming. No one spoke. Renner kept his grip tight on her arm. Donnelly walked beside them, head down, avoiding every lens aimed in their direction. At the cruiser, Renner pushed her into the back seat with unnecessary force. The cuffs bit into her wrists. You just made this very easy for me, he said through the open door. You kept talking, refused to cooperate, made me nervous. She stared up at him, head tilted slightly. You weren't nervous, she said. You were excited. She adjusted herself without flinching, and the door slammed shut behind her, echoing through the quiet street. In the front seat, Donnelly exhaled. She's going to file. She's got nothing, Renner replied. Some shiny plaques and a story. We've got footage of the weapon, the case file, her resisting. You turned off the cams. Renner turned to him, his eyes sharp. You want out? Go ahead. Tell IA you got cold feet. But you know how this works. We do the paperwork right. She gets buried in process. Maybe she fights it, maybe she doesn't. Either way, we're not the ones in handcuffs right now. Donnelly looked out the windshield. For the first time, the cruiser felt like a cage, and he wasn't sure who was trapped inside. Back at the house, porch lights flickered on one by one. Windows edged open, cautious eyes peeking through blinds as wordless curiosity spread from door to door. Neighbors who had once waved at Celeste during morning walks or offered brief, polite nods as they pulled in groceries now stood in stunned, frozen silence, uncertain whether to speak, record, or retreat behind the false safety of glass and curtains. The moment no longer belonged to any one person. It had become a spectacle. Inside the cruiser, Celeste remained still. The red marks on her wrists had already begun to bloom, but she gave no sign of discomfort. She adjusted herself in silence, chin lifted, gaze steady, her presence inside the squad car not that of a suspect, but of someone taking inventory, not of damage, but of consequences. Renner climbed into the passenger seat with an air of finality, the weight of the door thudding closed beside him. His tone remained casual, as if everything that had just unfolded had already been justified in his mind. "You know, people like her think they're untouchable," he muttered, adjusting the rearview mirror to catch a glimpse of her restrained in the back. "Live in a nice neighborhood, act like they're above it all. But when you dig beneath, it's all the same." Donnelly said nothing. His hands remained on the wheel, knuckles white, knotted with a tension he couldn't quite explain. His eyes flicked to the dashboard, then to the road ahead, but never to the mirror. Whatever instinct had stirred back at the house was now growing louder, insistent, harder to suppress with empty rationalizations. They drove in silence through darkened residential streets, passing empty intersections and blinking traffic lights that gave the city a rhythm of ghostly calm. When they turned into the precinct parking lot, a squat, aging building whose facade bore the faint discoloration of time and underfunding, it became clear that the place was alive in all the wrong ways. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A tired-looking sergeant leaned against the doorway, smoking beneath a Community First banner that fluttered in the breeze with unintentional irony. Celeste was led in through the back entrance, her cuffs digging deeper into her skin with every pull forward. Officers glanced up from their desks as she passed. Some paused their paperwork. Others chuckled under their breath. One leaned toward his colleague and said low, "Guess she thought no one would notice her little side hustle." The smirk that followed was reflexive, practiced, the kind that didn't require truth to flourish. Only a target. Renner made no effort to temper the narrative. As he passed the front desk, he dropped a manila folder onto the counter and offered his version with theatrical efficiency. Black female, early 40s, unregistered weapon found in wall safe. Claims she's with the feds. No paperwork to show for it. We'll process and hold until verification. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Did she give a name? Said she was director something, Renner replied with a shrug. Probably watches too many movies. Laughter murmured through the room like static. Celeste didn't flinch. She was led to the booking station, where she stood straight-backed beneath flickering lights that cast long shadows across the scuffed linoleum. When the technician reached for her hands, she raised them with quiet obedience. Her fingertips met the scanner glass with practiced ease. The machine beeped. Once, then again. But no data populated the screen. Renner had, of course, entered the information incorrectly. A deliberate misspelling. A manufactured void. "She's not showing up," the clerk muttered. "Big surprise," Renner answered without missing a beat. "Probably gave us a fake." Donnelly stood off to the side, arms crossed, shoulders stiff. He watched the exchange without speaking, the tightness in his chest now stretching into something heavier, something that no longer felt like procedural discomfort, but more like the slow, undeniable realization of being caught in the early stages of a disaster. Celeste turned her head slightly, her voice cool and unwavering. "I want my phone call." Renner waved his hand dismissively. Yeah. After we finish intake. You've already booked me. You've submitted a charge. You've entered me into the system. I am entitled, under state and federal law, to one phone call immediately upon completion of arrest protocol. You are now violating that right." Renner exhaled through his nose and gestured toward the caged phone room. "Go ahead. Knock yourself out." Escorted into the side room, Celeste stepped toward the receiver without hesitation. She lifted it from the hook, dialed a number from memory, one of only 3 committed to it for precisely this kind of scenario, and waited. The line clicked once. A voice answered, crisp and alert. Celeste spoke with the full weight of authority that neither the cuffs on her wrists nor the wreckage of her home could diminish. "This is Director Celeste James. Activate the Federal Response Team. They just raided my house." She ended the call without another word. When she turned, Renner stood just outside the threshold, one hand on his belt, his expression flickering between doubt and amusement. He looked at Donnelly, who stood farther down the hallway, his face pale, brow damp. "Director, huh?" Renner said with a smirk. "She's good. I'll give her that." But Donnelly didn't return the smirk. And in that moment, neither of them realized that the air in the building had already begun to change, not because of what they had done, but because of who, exactly, they had just done it to. The walls of the precinct seemed to settle back into their usual rhythm. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly over desks, cluttered with half-filled report forms and lukewarm coffee cups. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, and muffled voices passed case files and sarcasm in equal measure. No one spoke of the woman who now sat in holding, except in quick quips or dismissive mutters. The officers on duty assumed it was already over. Another caller. Another exaggerator who talked too big and folded once the door closed behind her. Renner leaned back in a rolling chair near the front of the bullpen, legs stretched. A smug grin still etched across his face as he worked on the narrative that would accompany the arrest. Every detail would be written in the passive tone of law enforcement fiction. Suspect was combative, officers proceeded with caution. Unregistered weapon was discovered in a concealed safe. He would conveniently forget the body cam outage. He would emphasize the resistance that had never occurred. Everything would be squared away in a few paragraphs, signed and sealed before sunrise. Donnelly sat across the room, elbows on his knees, staring at a file he hadn't turned the page on in over 20 minutes. His mind had replayed the sound of her voice on the phone at least a dozen times. The calm authority, the certainty, the chilling precision of the words. "Activate the Federal Response Team." He kept trying to tell himself it was a bluff, the kind people make when they're cornered. But bluffers stammer, bluffers fold. She hadn't done either. At precisely 1:16 a.m., the first sound that unsettled the precinct was so subtle it was almost ignored. The heavy, synchronized thrum of tires grinding to a halt on the gravel behind the building. A second later came the unmistakable slam of car doors, methodical and unhurried, followed by footsteps that didn't hesitate between paces. By the time the front doors of the station swung open, 3 black SUVs sat parked across the rear lot, their engines still idling like they were waiting for someone who wouldn't be staying long. The room shifted at once. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Chairs rolled back. Heads turned. And then they entered. 4 agents in dark suits moved through the precinct lobby without introduction or explanation. Their expressions were unreadable, their steps deliberate. No one reached for a badge. No one needed to. The air around them was their identification, years of precision, power, and rank woven into their posture. One of them, a tall black man with a clipped beard and earpiece coiled at his jawline, stepped forward with a leather folder in hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I need access to your holding area. Now." The desk sergeant blinked, hands frozen over a keyboard. "And you are—" The agent opened the folder, tilted it forward, and held it steady for precisely 2 seconds. "Agent Marcus Thorne, Department of Homeland Security." A slow inhale passed through the room like a ripple. The name carried weight. More than that, it carried context. DHS did not send ground agents to local precincts at 1 in the morning without cause. Before the sergeant could fumble for a reply, another agent stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "Where is Director Celeste James?" The pause that followed was the longest moment of the night. Renner, halfway out of his chair, straightened abruptly, his body stiffening like he'd been struck. Donnelly stood, the color draining from his face entirely. Several officers looked toward each other, blinking in disbelief, suddenly scrambling to remember every word they'd said in the past few hours. The lead agent looked around the room once, eyes sweeping across the stunned faces like a lens, locking in on every movement, every attempt to recede into the background. He pointed toward the hallway with a slow, measured hand. She outranks every single person in this building. The room froze. Not one person spoke. Not one offered a defense. Renner tried to muster something, some half-spoken protest about mistaken identity, about records not matching, about false claims, but nothing made it past his lips. His mouth opened, then closed. He sat down. Thorne gave no time for rebuttals. He walked past the desk and straight toward the holding corridor. The door buzzed open. The agents entered as if the building belonged to them, because, in truth, it did now. A minute later, the door opened again, and Celeste walked out. Not flanked, not escorted, but accompanied. The cuffs had been removed. Her blouse was wrinkled, her wrist still marked by red lines, but her posture hadn't lost a single degree of its precision. Her gaze swept the bullpen, locking eyes with every officer who had dismissed, insulted, or manhandled her. No one met her stare for more than a second. No voices called after her. No apologies were offered. The sound of her shoes on the linoleum was the only noise that filled the precinct as she moved calmly toward the exit. Renner stood slowly, almost involuntarily, as if pulled upward by a need to reassert control. But Celeste didn't even glance in his direction. She passed him as though he didn't exist, and in that moment, for all his bluster and badge, he didn't. Donnelly watched from the far corner of the room, his arms limp at his sides. He didn't try to hide his shame. And when Celeste paused at the threshold of the precinct doors, her eyes met his. Not with forgiveness, but with something far colder. Recognition. He had known better, and he had chosen not to act. Outside, the SUV doors opened without a word. Celeste entered the back seat. The convoy pulled away, engines humming into the night, disappearing as smoothly as they had arrived. Inside, the station remained still. The routine had been shattered. And though no alarms had sounded, every officer in the room knew something had changed. Something permanent. The morning sun filtered reluctantly through the shattered remains of her living room window, brushing across a floor strewn with broken glass, overturned furniture, and the fractured remnants of a life upended. Celeste stood in the center of it all, unmoving, her eyes scanning what had once been an immaculate space, now reduced to a crime scene of state-sanctioned violence. The scent of displaced dust hung in the air, tinged faintly with the cold bite of last night's violation. Books lay face down, spines cracked. Her awards and citations, once displayed in a precise grid along the wall, had been swept to the floor, their frames splintered like kindling. The safe that had been pried open still hung ajar, its contents scattered with theatrical carelessness. Her home, once a fortress of quiet dignity and order, had been desecrated by those sworn to uphold the very laws they had chosen to ignore. Beyond the shattered porch, the world was stirring. The narrow street where joggers once passed in the early hours had become a theater of curiosity and reckoning. Media vans lined the curb, their satellites reaching skyward like metallic thorns. Reporters huddled near their cameras, gripping coffee cups and flipping through last-minute notes as crews adjusted lenses. No one dared approach the house, not yet, but the anticipation was a physical presence in the air, dense and humming, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside, Agent Marcus Thorne stood at the edge of the room, his usual composure tinged with something more solemn than professional detachment. He had seen many scenes like this, Homes shattered. Lives disrupted. Dignity trampled under the weight of unchecked authority. But this one felt different, not just because of who the victim was, but because of what had already begun to stir in the wake of it. The team has confirmed media outlets are in position. We've cleared the perimeter for your safety. It's your call how you want to proceed. Celeste didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on a photo that had slid beneath the bookshelf during the raid. A black and white image of her mother, standing in front of a church, smile proud, fists clenched at her sides. She reached down slowly and picked it up, brushing away dust with the side of her thumb. A breath passed through her chest, measured, controlled. "Has the department been briefed?" she asked at last, her voice even, though it carried a new edge beneath the restraint. "Yes, ma'am. The secretary was informed last night. Full authority remains in your hands. No interference." She nodded, straightened her back, and turned toward the hallway. "Then we go public. Today." The press conference was held on federal grounds, the steps of a Justice Department building chosen deliberately for its symbolic weight and proximity to power. The podium had been placed beneath the seal of the United States, flanked by DHS officials and federal law enforcement, each one chosen with meticulous precision. Black, brown, white, male, female, all standing in silent, united contrast to the image of last night's raid. Celeste arrived precisely on time, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back, the swelling on her wrist concealed beneath the sleeve. She carried no notes. As she stepped to the microphone, the camera shutters burst into sound. The moment was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the public now, to the nation watching, to every woman and man who had ever been silenced behind closed doors and badged injustice. She began without greeting. "Last night, in the quiet of my home, a group of officers from the 32nd Precinct forced entry without a warrant, without identifying themselves, and without cause. They restrained me with excessive force, damaged property, and fabricated charges in an attempt to justify their illegal actions." The crowd of reporters stood transfixed. "I am Celeste James, Director of Homeland Security." She let the silence that followed stretch long and unflinching, allowing the weight of her words to land in every ear and every lens. She did not soften them. She did not shield the public from the truth with the usual diplomatic buffer. They did not know who I was. They did not ask. They made assumptions based on my address, my appearance, and a falsified tip traced to an internal source within their own department. They acted without due process, and they were wrong. From the edge of the crowd, a gasp carried faintly through the static of recording devices. "Effective immediately," she continued, "a full federal investigation has been launched into the conduct of the 32nd Precinct, including its leadership, internal affairs practices, case handling, and use of force history. Every officer involved in last night's raid has been suspended pending investigation. The police chief has been notified. The mayor has been briefed." She paused once more, her eyes scanning the sea of cameras, microphones, and notepads. "This is not just about me. This is about the unchecked culture of assumption, aggression, and impunity that too often hides behind the shield of authority. This time, it was a director. But before that, it was a teacher, a nurse, a father, a child. We must draw the line, here and now." She stepped back from the microphone. There was no applause, no dramatic music, only the deafening echo of truth as it settled across the city and radiated outward like a signal flare. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but Celeste did not return to the podium. She had said what needed to be said. By mid-afternoon, headlines had spread across every major network. Director of Homeland Security, wrongfully arrested in illegal raid. Federal probe targets rogue precinct. She outranks you all. The moment the system turned. Within hours, the officers involved were formally suspended. Their names, now public record, flashed across screens in bold fonts. Their booking photos from prior disciplinary hearings unearthed and republished with biting clarity. The precinct's phone lines were flooded. City officials scrambled to release carefully crafted statements. But the narrative had already been claimed, and it did not belong to them. Celeste returned home that evening beneath a quiet sky. The crowd had gone. The media had moved back. But inside the house, the damage remained. Not just physical, but symbolic. Still, as she stepped over a cracked picture frame and made her way to the control room where the servers still pulsed quietly in the dark, she felt no rage, no fear, only purpose. By the time the sun had fully set on the day of the press conference, the story had already taken on a life of its own, reshaped, amplified, and refracted through 1,000 different lenses across the country. News anchors, podcast hosts, and opinion columnists each seized the moment with fervor, cycling Celeste James's name through chyrons and hashtags as if trying to pin down something too large to fully capture in headlines alone. It wasn't just the raid or the fact that she was Director of Homeland Security. It was what it revealed. The casual violence, the unchecked assumptions, the systemic cracks so deep they had dared to swallow a federal official without hesitation. Within hours, social media platforms erupted. Videos surfaced, not of the raid itself, which had been conducted with cameras conveniently disabled, but of other incidents tied to the same precinct. Cell phone footage showed a black teenager slammed against a fence for jaywalking. Another clip revealed Officer Cole Renner shouting threats at a man who had merely questioned why his car was being searched. A grainy recording captured Donnelly standing silent during an aggressive stop involving an elderly Latino man. These weren't new clips, but they had been buried, quietly passed over, dismissed, or under investigation, long enough to fade from the public's attention. Until now. Now, they were evidence. Each new video was stitched into viral compilations, reposted under banners like "Bamais, she was the director" and "Naand 30-second truth," hashtags that trended globally by midnight. Comment sections filled with outrage, not only for Celeste, but for the countless unnamed victims whose stories hadn't triggered a federal response because they didn't carry a badge or a title. For every person who had once been told they were imagining the bias, the footage was vindication. For every family that had filed a complaint and been ignored, the headlines were a long overdue acknowledgement. The rage was real, and it moved fast. Civil rights organizations mobilized almost immediately. The Legal Justice Coalition released a joint statement condemning the officers involved and demanding the appointment of an independent oversight board. The NAACP scheduled a march for the following weekend. Black legal scholars appeared on major networks, laying out the constitutional violations in precise detail, while former officers spoke out against the culture of impunity that had flourished for years in precincts like the 32nd. Outside the precinct building, crowds gathered. What began as a quiet vigil quickly evolved into a rally. Protesters carried signs with phrases like, "You can't erase the truth," "Who's next?" and "Justice wears a face you ignored." The energy was intense but disciplined. No fires, no broken windows, just voices raised in unison, some crying, some chanting, all unwilling to let the news cycle bury the moment too soon. Inside her home, Celeste watched none of it. She refused interviews. She declined television requests. She issued no further public statements. Her silence was deliberate, calculated. In a world where people rushed to own narratives, to inject their voices into the storm, Celeste let the facts speak. Let the voices of others rise. She understood better than most that credibility wasn't in how loudly you demanded justice. It was in how precisely you built it, brick by brick, with actions that could not be unraveled. Thorne had offered to set up a private security perimeter, but she declined. She had nothing to hide, and she wasn't going anywhere. Let them see her house. Let them see what it looked like when the state broke into the home of a law-abiding citizen. Let the ruins speak for themselves. She spent her hours not in interviews, but in debriefings. The task force had begun cataloging complaints filed against the 32nd Precinct over the last 7 years. The numbers were staggering. Dozens of excessive force complaints, a string of cases where video footage was inexplicably lost or corrupted, and a pattern of arrests clustered suspiciously in the city's historically black neighborhoods. Worse, internal affairs had marked the majority of these cases as unsubstantiated, often citing lack of cooperation from victims who had, in reality, never been contacted for follow-up. Each page told a story, each form a quiet betrayal, dressed in bureaucratic indifference. Celeste reviewed them all. She made notes in the margins, highlighted patterns, marked connections between names and dates, between officers and outcomes. To the public, the raid had been a shocking misstep. To Celeste, it was confirmation. Her investigation into internal corruption had never been about suspicion. It had been about timing, about watching the net tighten until those responsible became confident enough to make one wrong move. They had. Now, she had everything she needed. Still, it was not vengeance she moved toward. It was restoration. Her aim wasn't just to remove a few bad actors, but to disassemble the culture that allowed them to flourish unchecked. This moment, magnified by public attention, wasn't just a chance to punish. It was a mandate to rebuild. Across the country, mayors and governors began quietly reviewing their own departments, wary of similar scandals erupting under their watch. Internal memos circulated. Compliance checks were ordered. Police chiefs held emergency meetings. What had happened in one quiet neighborhood had become a mirror, reflecting unspoken truths back at a system long overdue for reckoning. And through it all, Celeste remained still, not silent, not idle. Still, because when the whole world was rushing to catch up to the truth, the one who had already known it didn't need to shout. The 32nd Precinct had always carried the scent of wear and authority. Old linoleum masked with fresh polish, coffee-stained walls patched with half-hearted paint jobs, the unrelenting echo of heavy boots crossing tile floors day and night. But on this morning, the air had shifted. It wasn't just tension, it was scrutiny. It was the unmistakable hum of a system being peeled open, layer by layer, in full view of the very institution it once believed it could hide behind. By 7:00 a.m., a team of federal agents in tactical suits, backed by internal affairs personnel and overseen by Department of Justice auditors, entered through the front and back entrances simultaneously. They bore no weapons drawn, no battering rams or yelling. Their presence was silent, but absolute. Clipboards, scanners, and sealed evidence crates replaced the usual clatter of radios and hallway banter. The raid wasn't a show of force. It was a reclaiming of truth, executed with surgical precision. Captain Halverson, the precinct commander, had barely taken 2 steps into the building when he was intercepted at the door by a federal supervisor and handed a warrant that bore the full weight of Homeland Security's investigative authority. His face turned an unnatural shade of pale. The page trembled slightly in his hands as he skimmed the first paragraph. "You have no jurisdiction here," he managed, though it sounded more like a wish than a declaration. "We do now," the agent replied calmly, stepping past him without pause. Desks were cleared, computers unplugged and bagged. servers detached and sealed into black forensic containers. Lockers were opened, their contents catalogued and photographed. Every file cabinet was emptied, page by page, the contents logged under chain of custody protocols, while officers stood off to the side, watching the dismantling of their home turf with quiet dread. There were no accusations shouted, no hands thrown up in protest. This was not an ambush. This was accountability, slow, methodical, and absolute. One officer, a tall man with buzzed hair and a decorated sleeve of unit patches along his arm, suddenly broke from the line. Without warning, he turned and made for the back stairwell, muttering something no one could hear. Agent Reyes, who had been quietly reviewing body cam audits by the reception desk, didn't even glance up. She lifted her radio and spoke into it with the calm of someone who had done this 100 times. Unit 2, East Stairwell. Possible evasion. Within seconds, 2 agents intercepted the officer before he reached the emergency exit. He was restrained without incident. The only sound that followed was the buzz of the security door locking behind them as they escorted him to a side room. At the far end of the hallway, Officer Gregson, a second-tier sergeant known more for silence than swagger, sat at his desk, his fingers hovering above a keyboard that hadn't moved in minutes. His breathing had grown shallow, sweat forming along his collar despite the cold. As the files from Internal Affairs rolled past him, each one bearing names, dates, and digital timestamps, something inside him seemed to crack open. He stood abruptly, not with the confidence of resistance, but with the unmistakable tremble of collapse. An Internal Affairs investigator turned as he approached, notebook in hand. "I need to talk," Gregson said, his voice hollow. "I can't carry this anymore." They led him quietly into an interview room. Inside, the dam broke. He spoke of falsified tips, anonymous messages crafted by officers within the department to justify raids in specific neighborhoods. He described the way evidence had been discovered only after rooms were cleared of witnesses. He admitted that reports were often rewritten hours after arrests, language softened, footage quietly corrupted or deleted. He named names, not just Renner, not just Donnelly. He listed lieutenants, dispatchers, field supervisors, people who had allowed the rot to fester by pretending it didn't exist. "I didn't do all of it," he said at one point, barely above a whisper. "But I watched, and I didn't stop it." He looked up at the agent across from him, eyes rimmed red. They came after her because she made them nervous. She didn't act scared like the others. And they hated that. The confession was recorded in full, transcribed, and signed. Within an hour, Gregson was under protective review. His name was added to a separate list, one for whistleblowers to be considered for immunity, depending on the scope of cooperation. As word of his confession spread through the building, the silence among the other officers deepened. Even those who had never crossed a line now feared the light sweeping through the precinct. The problem wasn't that 1 or 2 of them had made bad decisions. It was that the institution had made space for them, had shaped itself around silence and plausible deniability, until no one could tell where the fault lines began. Out in the main bullpen, Renner's desk sat empty. He hadn't reported in that morning. Donnelly, however, had. He sat in the conference room, staring through the glass at the chaos unfolding around him. He hadn't been questioned yet, but he knew it was coming. He felt it in the way the agents walked past without acknowledging him, in the way files were being stacked with his name printed cleanly at the top. His phone buzzed silently in his pocket. A message from a number he didn't recognize. You still have a choice. No sender. No reply. He didn't need to guess who had sent it. Across the city, Celeste remained out of view. She didn't need to show up at the precinct to make her presence felt. The wheels had already been set in motion. Her voice wasn't needed in the room anymore. The evidence spoke louder than any speech ever could. And in that building, Once thought impenetrable, the walls had begun to shift. While the precinct unraveled under the weight of its own secrets, Celeste moved with purpose through quieter halls, far from the cameras, far from the chaos, into the heart of the investigation she had long prepared for. Beneath the secured floors of DHS Field Division 4, where fluorescent lights hummed low and steel doors closed with biometric seals, the real work was underway. In the dim hum of the surveillance room tucked beneath DHS Field Division 4, lines of code cascaded across the high-resolution monitors like rivers of truth finally breaking through stone. The hum of cooled servers filled the space with a low, constant pulse as Celeste stood behind the lead digital forensics analyst, her arms folded, eyes fixed on the screen as though the data itself owed her an explanation. What they were uncovering wasn't just a mistake, it was a blueprint, deliberate, engineered, and precisely executed. "Confirmed," the analyst said, tapping a key that froze the screen on a chain of timestamps. The original message, what they used to justify the raid, was sent through a spoofed account routed through 3 proxy servers. But when we pulled the origin node's metadata, we found 2 overlapping IP signatures. Both are departmental. One's from the internal server at 32nd. The other is trickier. Celeste didn't blink. "Where?" The analyst hesitated. "It came from a mobile hotspot registered under an officer's personal device. We traced the MAC address. The phone was on precinct grounds 3 nights ago. It pinged cell towers twice, once near the station, once in your neighborhood. Less than 5 minutes after the tip was submitted." Celeste leaned forward, the glow of the monitor catching the faint shadow under her eyes from sleepless nights. "Show me who it belongs to." The analyst tapped through a few more screens, bringing up a personnel file. A photograph loaded. Officer Shane Ledger, 38, Tech Liaison, Records Access, Quiet, no write-ups, no commendations. A perfect middle ground officer, unnoticed, unimpressive, and invisible in plain sight. The kind of man who never raised suspicion because he never took credit, never stood out, never made himself into a target. Until now. "What else do we know about him?" Celeste asked, voice like polished stone. "He has access to dispatch logs, digital archives, internal comms. No direct involvement in the raid, but he was on duty the night before it. Logged into the precinct database for over 2 hours. Most of that time was spent reviewing your address, past surveillance logs, and department policy on high-risk residential search. So he studied how to make it look legitimate." The analyst nodded slowly. "He planted the tip, ma'am. He built it from inside." Celeste stepped back from the screen, the truth settling not like a hammer, but like a cold, surgical incision. This had never been about a hasty mistake or an overzealous officer. This had been a calculated move, plotted not from the chaos of the street, but from the quiet corridors of access and knowledge. Someone had studied her patterns, her cover, the limits of departmental oversight, and sent in pawns to execute a play designed to seem coincidental. And if it was Ledger who sent the message, the larger question now loomed. Who told him to? Because Shane Ledger didn't have the authority to target a federal official on his own, not unless he was acting on someone else's instructions. Thorne stepped into the room, his expression unreadable, a tablet tucked beneath his arm. "I assume you saw it?" he asked quietly. Celeste nodded. "He didn't act alone." "No. And we've started digging deeper into his communications. There's something else." He tapped the tablet and turned it toward her. An encrypted text thread, partially decoded, scrolled across the screen, half redacted, half recovered. The conversation wasn't long, but the intent was unmistakable. "Need the trigger pulled. She's too close, already in motion. No fingerprints. Good. She doesn't leave untouched." Celeste stared at the words, each line a surgical cut into the illusion of coincidence that had shrouded the raid until now. These weren't panicked messages sent in the heat of the moment. These were instructions. This was an orchestration. This was sabotage. "How long have they been watching me?" she asked. "We can't say for certain," Thorne replied, "but the logs suggest your home server was pinged remotely at least 5 times over the past month. Low frequency, deep trace. Whoever this is, they didn't want access to your devices. They wanted your routine, your hours, your blind spots." Celeste's gaze darkened. "They knew I was building the investigation." "They didn't just know," Thorne said. "They tried to shut it down before it matured. And when they couldn't get close enough quietly, they tried to discredit you publicly." A long silence settled between them. Not paralysis, calculation. This wasn't just about an officer gone rogue. It was about infiltration. It was about proximity. Someone inside the very system she had been working to reform had decided the best solution to a growing threat wasn't to challenge her findings, but to destroy her credibility before they ever reached daylight. And they'd failed. Now they were exposed. Celeste looked back at the screen one last time, then turned away. "Find everyone Ledger's been in contact with in the last 60 days. Phone, email, internal memos, everything. If he's part of something larger, I want it dissected. Quietly. No alerts." Thorne nodded and stepped aside to begin assembling the task team. As Celeste walked down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her thoughts remained composed, not racing, not overwhelmed. This was no longer just a case of brutality or misconduct. It was a conspiracy. And somewhere inside the walls of the very agency she had sworn to protect, someone had written her name on a line they never thought would be uncovered. But they had miscalculated. She didn't vanish. She rose. And while Celeste worked in silence, letting the weight of truth gather momentum behind closed doors, the first tremor came not from her next move, but from someone who had been watching all along. A ripple stirred across the city, not in a courtroom or briefing room, but on the courthouse steps where a young man finally stepped out of the shadows and chose to speak. It began not with a press release or a breaking headline, but with a single voice cracking under the weight of years spent watching from the sidelines. Officer Daniel Reyes, 28 years old, 3 years into his first assignment, stood in front of a line of microphones outside the courthouse, hands trembling as he unfolded the note card in his fingers. The cameras had only gathered a dozen deep at first. Local stations, independent bloggers. But within minutes, word spread that a current officer was about to speak publicly. By the time he looked up from the card, the crowd had doubled. He cleared his throat, but his voice did not waver when it came. "I was told when I joined the department that silence was loyalty, that questioning orders made you a liability, that if you wanted to make it, you had to keep your head down and your mouth shut. I believed that for too long. I saw things I shouldn't have. I ignored them. I let people tell me it wasn't my place to push back. But after what happened to Director Celeste James, I realized silence wasn't loyalty. It was complicity." He paused, breath catching. What happened to her wasn't a mistake. It was part of a culture, one that rewards aggression, punishes restraint, and treats accountability like an attack. I can't be part of it anymore. No theatrics, no dramatic finish, just the truth, spoken without polish, and made all the heavier because of it. Within hours, more followed. A dispatcher named Julia Brandt, 15 years into the job and known for her near-perfect shift records, filed a sworn affidavit through her union. In it, she described receiving direct verbal instructions 3 separate times over the last year to lose specific 911 call recordings tied to controversial stops made by the 32nd Precinct. The orders hadn't come through official memos. They were given quietly, in corners of the operations room where no transcripts could catch them. She had complied, she admitted. She had deleted recordings, reassigned call tags, and edited timestamps at the request of superior officers. But now, she wanted to make it right. Other voices joined in, each one adding weight to the story that had, until now, been considered isolated. A rookie patrolman shared that body cam footage was often reviewed off-record by sergeants before being submitted, allowing corrections to narratives before they were locked into evidence. A former precinct clerk admitted she had been pushed out of her role after questioning why certain civilian complaints never appeared on internal logs. The testimonies did not come in a flood, but in a steady, unrelenting stream. Each one corroborated the last. Each one chipped away at the facade the department had spent years constructing. At City Hall, the district attorney's office could no longer afford to remain a silent observer. D.A. Helen Stroud, a pragmatic figure known more for cautious procedure than sweeping action, stepped in front of a podium and delivered a rare midday statement. In light of recent revelations and the growing body of credible testimony, the DA's office is launching a separate parallel inquiry into the 32nd Precinct, its command structure, and historical conduct records dating back a full decade. This inquiry will proceed independently of the federal investigation and will include subpoena power, public hearings, and full transparency measures. The announcement sent shockwaves through the city's legal apparatus. Judges began quietly reviewing past cases linked to officers now under investigation. Defense attorneys filed motions for reopened trials. Civil suits were drafted in overnight sessions, piling up as families and individuals realized their experiences might finally carry weight beyond dismissed paperwork. Within the precinct itself, morale fractured along unseen lines. Some officers, those who had known and feared the day of reckoning would come, kept their heads low and their mouths shut, hoping the storm might pass. Others began speaking in whispers, calculating who might turn next, which decisions from years past might come back to claim their careers. A few, to their quiet credit, began their own reports, documents long overdue, filled out in break rooms and conference offices after hours, names and dates scrawled onto internal complaint forms, finally submitted without fear of instant retribution. And through it all, Celeste said nothing to the public. She remained in motion, briefing her legal team, coordinating cross-agency cooperation, and overseeing the investigative matrix now sprawling across whiteboards and encrypted drives. Her silence was not absence, it was orchestration. She knew this part of the storm well. These were the days when systems that had long hidden their rot began to crack under the weight of light. She didn't need to rush them. She only needed to let the truth settle in. One affidavit, one confession, one unburied report at a time. The city, once divided in its response, began to tip. Editorials that had initially speculated whether the raid was a tragic misunderstanding now ran full retractions, calling for structural reform. Community leaders who had once felt abandoned by the system now held press events shoulder to shoulder with elected officials. Their unity no longer symbolic, but strategic. Public trust, long eroded, had found an anchor in her restraint, in the proof that quiet precision could do what outrage alone never could. In one of her rare private moments, Celeste stood alone in her command office, staring out the window at the courthouse steps where Officer Reyes had spoken days before. The scene was empty now, cleared of cameras, but the memory remained. A young man with shaking hands, standing straighter than he ever had in uniform. She didn't know what had finally pushed him to speak. Maybe it was the sight of her being led from her own home in cuffs. Maybe it was the years he had swallowed what he saw, waiting for permission to release the guilt. Or maybe, just maybe, It was the first time he realized that justice wasn't waiting for someone stronger to arrive. It had always been waiting for him. Celeste didn't smile, but her eyes softened. The reckoning had begun. But reckoning, Celeste knew, was not the same as resolution. The voices rising from the streets, the testimonies breaking open the walls of silence, the cameras that now refused to look away, none of it would be enough on its own. Noise could be powerful, but noise could also fade. What mattered now was what came next. By the end of the week, the political fallout reached its inevitable crescendo. Pressure from federal investigations, media scrutiny, and growing civilian unrest forced the chief of police to step down. The announcement came via a terse two-paragraph statement, read with shaking hands by a deputy chief, who looked like he'd aged 10 years since the raid. It cited health concerns and a desire not to distract from the department's mission. But no one watching believed a word of it. His resignation wasn't a choice, it was the last escape hatch on a ship that had been taking on water for years. The mayor, who had remained conspicuously silent through the early waves of scandal, finally emerged for an emergency press briefing on the steps of City Hall. The backdrop was carefully arranged. Diverse officers standing shoulder to shoulder, advisors clutching folders, American flags rustling slightly in the breeze. The mayor's tone was somber, every syllable shaped to signal humility and control. What happened to Director James was unacceptable. It was a failure, not just of a precinct, but of leadership, of oversight, and of the trust this city is supposed to uphold. Effective immediately, we are reviewing all use-of-force incidents from the past 5 years. We are expanding civilian review boards. We will begin working with federal liaisons to ensure this never happens again. The press clapped lightly, reporters shouted questions, and social media lit up with cautious optimism. Some were quick to call it a victory. But Celeste, watching from the quiet of her command office, heard what hadn't been said. There had been no mention of permanent oversight, no commitment to long-term reform, no binding policy beyond a flood of reviews and task forces that could be undone as easily as they were announced. It was apology disguised as progress, a carefully managed performance aimed at calming the noise, not curing the disease. She closed her tablet slowly and set it aside. Later that evening, she met with the acting director of the Federal Police Oversight Division, a plain-spoken woman named Lydia Grant, who had spent 2 decades investigating municipal corruption across 3 states. They sat across from each other in Celeste's office, surrounded by stacked files, active case maps, and a live feed from the Joint Operations Task Force that now monitored dozens of flagged departments. "We've seen it before," Lydia said quietly. "The public outcry, the resignations, the task force announcements. Then 6 months go by, the cameras disappear, and everything folds back in on itself. If we want lasting change, we need something with teeth." Celeste nodded. "I'm not here for a cycle. I want permanent oversight mechanisms, federal monitors embedded in every precinct under review. I want them to report directly to an independent bureau, not city leadership. And I want them protected from retaliation." "That's going to rattle a lot of cages," Lydia said, "not as a warning, but as a test." "Then let them rattle," Celeste replied. "They've built their careers on unchecked power. If that shakes them, they were never fit to serve." By the time the formal policy proposal was submitted, it was clear Celeste intended to do more than clean up a scandal. She intended to restructure the system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. The plan called for a multi-agency civilian integrity board, mandatory psychological assessments for high complaint officers, a centralized database of misconduct records accessible across jurisdictions, and federal monitors with clearance to observe, audit, and intervene without needing local approval. Opposition came swiftly. police unions decried it as federal overreach. Local officials whispered about budgets, sovereignty, and public perception. Even allies within the system worried that the scope was too aggressive, too disruptive. Celeste didn't flinch. She appeared before the Senate Subcommittee on Domestic Security and Accountability with the same calm presence that had once de-escalated foreign diplomats in war zones. She laid out the raid, the planted tip, the body cam deactivation, and the fabricated charges. She detailed the pattern of suppression, the erased evidence, the coded language officers used when they thought no one would decode it. And then she made it clear. This wasn't a political moment. It was a structural reckoning. Until accountability becomes institutional, abuse will always be personal, she said, her voice firm but unhurried. The problem is not just in the incidents, it's in the insulation. We cannot keep asking communities to trust a system that answers only to itself. This is not just about fixing what happened to me. It's about preventing what has happened to thousands whose names never reached a podium. She left the hearing without theatrics, refusing the swarm of reporters who waited outside. Her words echoed louder than any follow-up interview could have. Back in the city, momentum began to shift again, not with protest or scandal this time, but with policy. Lawmakers, once hesitant, began reviewing the proposal. Civil rights organizations launched petition drives in support. A handful of city leaders from across the country requested copies of the draft for their own jurisdictions. In the wake of chaos, Celeste had not sought revenge. She had built architecture, not just for justice, but for durability. And while her name no longer flooded headlines with the same frequency, her signature did. Printed at the bottom of every reform measure, every revised protocol, every new safeguard that would long outlast the noise of the moment. But even as the machinery of reform turned quietly through policy and oversight, the public still waited for the reckoning they could hold in their hands. The visible justice that didn't live in legislative language or structural audits, but in consequences felt and measured in real time. And in that regard, Celeste knew the reforms were only half the work. The other half, the part that still burned in the veins of a city betrayed, was waiting behind courthouse doors. 3 weeks after the policy package passed its first vote, the district attorney's office convened a grand jury. The investigation, already bolstered by internal testimonies, surveillance footage, falsified documents, and a mountain of digital evidence, was airtight. The names submitted for indictment weren't just the officers who had raided Celeste's home. They included those who had falsified reports afterward, those who had conspired to suppress prior complaints, and those who had quietly enabled it all by doing nothing. The indictments came down in clusters. Officer Cole Renner was indicted on 5 counts, including abuse of power, unlawful entry, excessive force, tampering with public records, and obstruction of justice. His name appeared on dozens of internal memos, flagged incident reports, and redacted dispatch entries that suddenly made sense when placed side by side. The digital forensics team had even recovered deleted message fragments from his work-issued phone, revealing conversations with other officers that included language impossible to defend under oath. Sergeant Rick Donnelly, whose complicity had been quieter but no less harmful, faced charges of falsifying records and failure to intervene during an unlawful act, a charge the reform measures had only recently made prosecutable through a newly strengthened clause. His silent nods, his unspoken permissions, and his role in smoothing over Renner's aggression were now matters of public record. Shane Ledger, the officer who had planted the false tip, was perhaps the most damning case. Though not present at the raid itself, the evidence against him was direct and inarguable. He was charged with conspiracy to commit a civil rights violation, willful misuse of government systems, and aiding and abetting in an unlawful act. His face once forgettable in the precinct halls, now appeared on national news broadcasts under the weight of betrayal. When the mugshots were released to the public, they did not arrive with commentary or excuses. There was no press conference, no performance of spin. They appeared as they were, 3 men against a gray background, their uniforms replaced with standard county-issue clothing, the arrest dates stamped across the bottom with bureaucratic finality. And the city took notice. The images flooded news cycles and social media streams not because of who the men were, but because of what they represented. For once, officers had not been placed on administrative leave with pay. They had not been reassigned or quietly protected under internal codes. They had been charged, formally, publicly, and without euphemism. Some of the accused chose to plea out, hoping for reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. Others prepared for trial, their lawyers scrambling to craft narratives about poor leadership, high-pressure environments, or misinterpreted protocols. But the core truth had already been captured, filed, and authenticated. They had participated in a raid based on a lie. They had brutalized a woman without cause. They had attempted to bury that truth until the weight of evidence cracked it wide open. Celeste did not attend the arraignments. She did not sit in the gallery or appear on courthouse steps. Her presence wasn't needed. The process she had initiated was now self-sustaining, driven not by personal vendetta, but by the system she had forced to face its own reflection. Still, behind the scenes, she monitored every stage. She reviewed transcripts. She attended closed briefings. She met with the DA's special counsel to ensure the trials wouldn't be reduced to spectacle or compromise. She had no interest in revenge, but she demanded clarity. The public had earned that much. In the weeks that followed, smaller cases began surfacing. Old complaints tied to the indicted officers were reopened. Victims once dismissed began receiving calls from attorneys they never thought would remember their names. Class action lawsuits were filed. Federal civil rights prosecutors took on parallel investigations. And through it all, the message was clear. Impunity was no longer the standard. The veil had been torn, and the world was watching. In one small neighborhood, where the raid had first shattered a quiet night, a mural began to take shape on the side of a community center. It depicted not Celeste's face, but her home, its frame intact, windows glowing warmly, rooted against a sky textured with coded language and broken chain links. Above it, in bold lettering, a single phrase stretched across the wall. Truth lives here. It was not a shrine to heroism. It was a warning, a reminder, a declaration that this time the silence had not been the end of the story. And within the courthouse chambers, beneath marble arches and lined wooden pews, justice finally moved not in whispers or delay, but in deliberate steps. One indictment at a time. But in the stillness that followed the thunder of public reckoning, Celeste James stood once again in the quiet of her own home, a place now both familiar and altered, like a rebuilt bridge over a river that had once nearly swept it away. The floorboards had been refinished, the shattered glass replaced, the walls patched and repainted in their original hues. But even as the structure stood whole again, it no longer breathed with the same unquestioned comfort. There was something changed in the air, not of fear or grief, but of knowledge, a weight that lingered in the silence like memory etched into drywall. She moved through the space with slow, deliberate steps, fingertips grazing the edge of her kitchen counter, pausing at the corner where her bookshelf had once collapsed. A new shelf stood in its place now, identical in design but filled with different books, new files, recent reports, binders labeled with acronyms that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. These were names of newly flagged departments, officers under quiet review, cities requesting external audit voluntarily. Each folder was a spark waiting to catch. each document proof that what began as a defense had evolved into a campaign. The sunlight spilled through the windows in clean columns, casting soft shadows across her desk, now home to 2 encrypted drives, a terminal link to the Oversight Task Force, and a thick, leather-bound journal whose pages she filled late at night with names, dates, reflections. Not for posterity, but for clarity. Even victories, she knew, required accounting. The house, in its repaired state, still carried faint reminders of the night it was broken into. A subtle creak in the hallway, where a boot had crushed a floorboard. A stretch of drywall with paint just a shade too perfect to match the rest. But she had chosen not to cover everything. Some signs, she believed, were meant to stay, not as trauma, but as testimony. She stood at the window overlooking the street where the raid had begun. The neighborhood was quieter now, less crowded with onlookers or media vans. The rhythm of suburban calm had returned, but with a different cadence. Neighbors who had once waved cautiously now nodded with a sense of reverence. Some brought meals, others mailed letters. A few just left notes, small handwritten acknowledgments folded beneath her door with words like, "Thank you for staying," or "I didn't know until I saw." Celeste hadn't answered most of them, not because she didn't appreciate the gestures, but because the work was far from finished. She didn't need gratitude, she needed vigilance. The front door opened without warning, but without threat. Only one man in her life ever walked into her house that way. Agent Marcus Thorne stepped into the foyer, removing his coat with that signature precision that had made him an ideal field operative for over 2 decades. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp but carrying the weariness of long hours and mounting responsibilities. "I knocked," he said, setting a takeout bag on the counter. "But you're worse than any perimeter alarm I've seen." "You heard me halfway down the block?" Celeste offered a faint smile, not from amusement, but recognition. "What did you bring?" "Something that doesn't come with paperwork or a briefing," he replied. "And no caffeine. You're 3 cups over your quota today." She raised an eyebrow. "You've started tracking my coffee?" "I've started tracking anything that keeps you vertical when you should be horizontal," he said, then added, "You haven't rested since the indictments." "I will," she said, though neither of them believed it. He pulled out containers, arranged them wordlessly on the counter. She didn't move to eat. Instead, she returned to the desk and opened a manila folder marked with a precinct number from another city, one now requesting voluntary oversight, inspired by the legislation her office had pushed through. Thorne watched her, arms crossed, leaning slightly against the edge of the island. He didn't speak for a long moment, letting the room settle around them, letting the weight of everything unsaid hang just long enough before choosing his moment. "You've done enough, Celeste. More than anyone could have expected. You've earned the right to step back." She didn't look up. "This was never just about me," she said. The answer came without pause, without defense. It wasn't deflection. It was clarity. She turned the page in the file. "I know," he said, "but even causes need commanders who can sleep." Celeste closed the folder gently, resting her hand over it. "I sleep," she said. Thorne gave a quiet laugh. "No, you drift. For 90 minutes. Between data pulls." She finally turned to face him. "There are people out there, Marcus, who still believe what happened to me was an exception. That justice was delivered because of my title. They don't see how close we came to burying the truth, how easy it would have been to erase me from my own home, my own name, if not for timing, access, pressure." Her voice didn't rise, but her eyes held steady. "I can't afford to vanish. Not yet." He studied her for a long moment before nodding, accepting the truth he already knew. "All right," he said. "But promise me one thing." "What's that?" "When this is over, and one day it will be, you'll walk through this house and remember that it stood. that you stood, not just for policy, not just for cases, but because they tried to silence you, and you answered with permanence. She didn't reply right away, but she placed the folder back into the cabinet, shut it gently, and turned back to the window. Outside, the street was still. A delivery driver passed. A child zipped by on a scooter. Nothing extraordinary, and yet everything had changed. "I'll remember," she said softly, "but only when I know the system will remember too." And in the quiet that followed, neither of them moved. Because sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought in courtrooms or streets. Sometimes they were fought in the silence that came after. And she was still standing. The months that followed brought less spectacle but more change. The headlines grew less frequent, the interviews tapered, and the images that once saturated every screen began to fade, at least on the surface. But beneath the media cycle's churn, the foundation had shifted. Not just in her city, but across the country. What started as a response had become a framework. Celeste had not returned to the field in a traditional sense. She had not resumed a public schedule or re-entered the daily churn of politics and press. Instead, she did something far more disruptive. She stayed. Quietly, firmly, and with relentless clarity. She remained at the helm of what had now grown into a permanent division within Homeland Security. It was not a symbolic entity. It was funded, staffed, codified into federal oversight law, and built to endure beyond the tenure of any one administration. The name was simple: the National Civil Oversight Task Force. Its mandate was exact. Its reach was national. Celeste's office signed the final executive order at precisely 9 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, her pen sweeping across the page with no ceremony, just finality. The legislation empowered her office to embed federal monitors in precincts with a history of misconduct, initiate surprise audits of internal records, and issue independent referrals to the Department of Justice without clearance from state or local governments. The Oversight Board, made up of prosecutors, civil rights advocates, retired law enforcement, and federal analysts, reported not to Congress or party commissions, but directly to the Office of the Inspector General. And Celeste, by unanimous internal vote, was named as its inaugural director. She had resisted the title at first, not because she feared the work, but because she understood the danger of building power without restraint. That had always been the root of the problem. But after reviewing the checks she had built into the system, after seeing the internal firewalls, the succession structure, and the civilian review pathways, all of which bore her fingerprints, she finally accepted. Not for herself, but for what would come after. Within the first month, 17 cities filed applications for voluntary audits. Some came from mayors eager to rebuild trust. Others came from departments with new leadership who saw oversight not as intrusion, but as partnership. In 2 cities, reform packages modeled after Celeste's template passed with overwhelming public support. Her legislation, once controversial, was now being taught in law schools and used as the cornerstone of new policing policy at the national level. She didn't claim credit. She didn't need to. The system had begun to remember. In early spring, Celeste stepped before the podium for what would be her final address to the public in an official capacity. The room was full. Cameras, reporters, policy leaders, civilians, and activists. But the tone was different now. No longer tense, no longer questioning, just waiting. She wore a dark slate suit, simple jewelry, no visible markers of power except for the quiet force she carried into every room. She did not read from a speech. Her words came as they always had, clear, composed, and measured not for applause, but for truth. "This country cannot afford to confuse authority with impunity," she said, her voice carrying not through volume, but through conviction. "Not again. Not ever. We owe it to ourselves to recognize that justice is not maintained by the loudest voice or the harshest punishment, but by the consistency of protection, by the architecture of truth. What happened to me could have happened to anyone, and it has happened to far too many. What makes this moment different is not that it happened, but that we chose to build something after it. She paused, letting the silence stretch, not awkward, but sacred. To those who still live with fear, who still wait for fairness to arrive at their door, know this: we are watching now, not just for you, but with you. She stepped back. No standing ovation, no orchestrated applause, just a room on its feet, quiet, bearing witness to something they didn't yet have words for. As the cameras cut, she turned from the podium, her coat already in her hand. She slipped it on without a word, buttoned it at the collar, and nodded once to the aide waiting by the exit. There were no reporters trailing her, no questions hurled in desperation. The silence was not an absence. It was an understanding. Another case was waiting. Not hers, but someone else's. A different city, a different badge, a different truth that had yet to be revealed. She stepped into the hall, footsteps steady, shoulders squared. The job was never just defense, it was reconstruction. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.